Thanks, everyone. Okay, hello and welcome to our first virtual backyard composting workshop. My name is Savannah Donovan. I'm the Environmental Program Manager at the Urbana Park District, and I work at the Anita Purvis Nature Center. Today I'm at home with my family, so hopefully they're going to be well behaved while I help to facilitate our workshop today. I'm going to have our guest presenters introduce themselves as well, and then I'll give a kind of brief overview of what our agenda is for this morning. So Courtney, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. My name is Courtney Kwong. I'm the recycling coordinator for the city of Urbana. And today I'm going to be giving you all, I pre-recorded a video regarding backyard composting and kind of the basics of backyard composting. So I'm going to go over the importance of composting, what's accepted in a backyard compost pile, the different types of composting methods that are available, and then local ordinances pertaining to backyard composting. And then after the pre-recorded video, I will be here to answer any questions you have. So feel free to put questions through the chat and I will answer any questions and go over things maybe in further detail.
Thanks, Courtney. And we're also joined by Stuart from Vermicculture.
Hey everyone, my name is Stuart and I'm a University of Illinois student. And today I'll be representing Vermiculture, which is a new environmental organization in the area.
Yeah, and he's got some exciting resources to be able to share with the community. So as Courtney said, she's got a slideshow presentation. It's got a lot of good information and visuals. We are probably going to spend about 40 minutes or so on that first segment. And I watched it last night. It's just chock full of lots of information. But if you feel like it's a lot to take notes on, we're going to have the recording. And also, you'll have access to those slides later on. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat as we go. If there was some reason why we needed to, pause and address your questions outside of the chat, we could do that too. And then I have a demo of my own composting setups that I have at home. So I'm going to walk you through kind of 3 different systems that I use at home and the benefits of each of them. And, that'll be a good opportunity to really kind of see how all this, the technical side of things, how do you implement that? And I'll be frank that I'm not an expert composter, even though I do it a lot at home. There's always more to learn. So that's where, Courtney's got a lot of that front end information that you'll need to know. And then Stuart's going to share information about vermiculture, which is, cultivating worms to help with composting. And we'll have lots of resources to share with you and a digital survey at the end of today. So if anybody has any questions right now, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to take just a second and start sharing Courtney's presentation.
Good morning.
Sorry, folks, just a second here. Okay, there we go. Just wanted to make sure the sound was going to work for you.
Today I'm going to be discussing Backyard Composting 101, the basics to start a successful backyard composting bin. I'm going to be going over a couple concepts today. I'm going to start off with the importance of composting, what can be placed in your compost pile, methods of composting, and also discuss local ordinances about backyard composting. In addition, feel free to ask any questions during the webinar and we will try to answer your questions. And at the end of the webinar, we will be providing all participants resources, including the slides from today, and also a worksheet on what composting method would work best for you and your household. First of all, I would like to start off with a definition of compost. Compost is decomposed organic materials such as leaves and vegetable scraps that are nutrient dense and act as a soil amendment. And compost is important for many reasons. One of those reasons is that it improves soil quality. Compost retains water and moisture levels in soil and adds essential nutrients to the soil such as hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. As compost decomposes, these nutrients become available for plant consumption, and compost encourages more microbial activity in the soil. So for us that live in East Central Illinois, our soil contains a lot of clay. And so adding compost, amending that soil really does improve its quality, and so makes for a better vegetable and plant garden. Compost also increases soil aeration. It physically improves the condition of the soil and promotes a thriving habitat for insects, worms, etc. Compost also prevents erosion. By layering compost on topsoil, it cushions rainfall and protects the soil underneath. Compost acts as a bonding agent for the soil structure. Compost also creates microorganisms that are beneficial to soil and plants to assist in disease prevention. Many folks aren't aware of this, that composting really does help resist plant diseases and not only improving the soil quality, but resist some of those plant diseases as well. Compost also helps resist a pH change in the soil. And compost saves money. When you compost, there's less need for fertilizer on plants. Compost acts as a soil additive for plants. It reduces the need to water plants. That's especially helpful in our summer months. And potentially lowers garbage bills because food scraps and landscape waste is diverted to the backyard compost bin. And I'll be going over that a little bit here shortly. Talking about diverting waste, the US EPA says that about 30% of household garbage could be diverted to the backyard compost bin. And so that includes mainly food scraps. And that averages about 1,200 pounds per household per year in the US. By composting, obviously less materials are landfilled, and so you reduce your carbon footprint and the amount of greenhouse gases generated. One of those top greenhouse gases that are generated is methane. And methane is generated when food scraps and landscape waste go to landfill. In Illinois, we do have a landscape waste ban that was implemented in the 1990s. So our landscape waste cannot go to landfills legally. However, food scraps still can. And so methane is generated from those types of materials. So it's important that we do start composting to reduce the methane that is generated from landfills. Here's a quote that I kind of like. It's called, "Compost is not a fertilizer. Fertilizer feeds plants and compost feeds the soil." Now this is the most important recipe for a successful compost bin. So on your screen I have the section that says brown and green. And what we mean by that is that the green is nitrogen, and the brown is carbon. So for a successful compost bin, we ask that you include 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So the materials that are considered carbon materials are sawdust, shredded paper, straw, pine needles, brown leaves, and corn stalks. And then green, the nitrogen-based materials include fruit and vegetable scraps, green grass clippings, coffee grounds or tea bags, plant trimmings, herbivore manure, and eggshells. And so the balance between the brown or the carbon materials and the green or nitrogen materials is very important. So again, you want to add 3 parts brown material to every 1 part green material. So 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen to get the perfect mix for your compost pile. If you have too many carbon materials or brown materials, it will make your compost pile decompose very slowly. We don't want that happening, and that will be time consuming and tedious. And also too many green or nitrogen-based materials will make the compost pile smell. So that's important that this balance is met. And here's another slide indicating some of the materials that you can compost. And also some recommendations. When you put these materials in, it's better to maybe for the brown leaves, you want to make sure they're shredded. Of course, they're a source of carbon. The dead plants and flowers, you can put into the compost, but they recommend you chop thicker stalks into smaller pieces. Is a great source of nitrogen. And a source of carbon, of course, is straw. It can be placed in your compost bin, and things like pine needles, sawdust, and wood chips as well. But when they recommend when you want to stay away from sawdust from cutting plywood or treated wood. The glue in the plywood contains a potentially toxic substance, so you do want to kind of stay away from any kind of treated wood. Another material is shredded newspaper. Again, it's better that you shred it up or make it into smaller pieces. It will decompose faster. So things like shredded paper, brush and shrubs, again, make it into smaller pieces, are great sources of carbon. Also, you can add in wood ash, corn stalks and husk. Again, chop them up before adding to the compost. That's a source of carbon. And then your fruits and veggie scraps. Again, you want to make sure that you bury any food scraps under leaves to minimize pests, and that's of course a source of nitrogen. And here's a few more things I won't go over. I'll let you look on the screen. I won't go over in further detail, but basically you want to make you want to shred things up and make so that makes the decomposition a little quicker. Here's a screen that talks about the different types of compostable materials and the carbon to nitrogen ratio. You don't necessarily need to know this, but it's kind of helpful. It's to see what you can learn from this. And that's just, there is a reading material called Composting to Reduce the Waste Stream. Below on the screen, and that's where I found this material, and it's kind of helpful for some folks. And here's a graphic that talks about the sources for compost. I found that graphic to be very helpful, and again, at the end of this webinar, we will have a handout. You can keep these slides and have this information readily available. And just as important as what you should compost is what you shouldn't compost. And these are the big no-nos, so that you want to have a successful compost pile that doesn't smell or bring in pests or vectors to your pile. One big no-no is meat and dairy products. Adding meat, whether it's cooked or raw, will add critters and create odors. Meat and dairy take longer to decompose than vegetable or fruit scraps, so you don't want to put that in your backyard compost pile. You also don't want to put in fish or fish parts. Again, there's serious odors, attracts critters and rodents, and is a big no-no. Also, bones will not decompose in the backyard compost bin without serious heat. So you're not doing a commercial composting operation, so bones you would want to keep that out of your compost bin. Also, you do not want to put in any grease, oil, and fat. These materials occupy air spaces needed for materials to compost properly, and they also decompose very, very slowly and create odors. You also don't want to put in your charcoal ash. That contains harmful chemicals to the soil, and it's not a good idea to put that in your compost. Also, any kind of diseased plants, it could spread the disease, and the pile may not heat up enough to kill the disease, so you want to keep those out of your compost pile as well. And finally, weed seeds. They could live through the compost process and spread when within the finished compost. So again, you do not want those in the compost pile as well. So for a successful compost bin recipe, the correct ratio of carbon to nitrogen is the key to success. Compost scientists say that the strive for a 30-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen is the best, but for beginners, we are going for a 3-to-1 carbon ratio, or carbon nitrogen ratio, and that's the easiest to follow. Everything you add to your compost will have some carbon, and nitrogen assists as a key component of proteins and enzymes that bacteria need to build their bodies and break down the food. Too much carbon makes the decomposition process slower because microorganisms can't find the nitrogen they need to build proteins and enzymes. And too much nitrogen allows for microbial growth and creates ammonia gas, making the compost pile smelly. So you really need to follow that ratio, and the 3-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio is the easiest way to follow that. And it's kind of hard to see on your screen, but again, at the end of this webinar, we'll provide you with our slides so you can get a better look at it. And this kind of just showing the layers of compost. And in your first layer, you could put in sticks, for example, to be the bottom layer. So you could have 4 to 6 inches of sticks in the bottom of a composter or at the bottom of your compost pile in your backyard. A second layer could be a layer of dried leaves. That's your brown material. The third layer, your green material, you can have about 2 to 4 inches of that on top. Then you put another brown material layer on top of that, and green and brown and so forth. So you kind of just want to follow this kind of recipe to get a good balance of the carbon nitrogen ratio. And they say for a successful compost pile, you do want to keep it moist, and they say as wet as a wrung out sponge. So that's kind of, if you can kind of feel the compost pile and make sure there's a little moisture in there, make sure it's not too dry. You also want to make sure you aerate your pile. Air, of course, helps speed up decomposition. Aeration should also be done throughout the entire composting process.
So I just wanted to stop for a second. Sorry about that. And tell you that this graphic I think is especially helpful for me as just kind of a regular composter at home. You'll see later that I have a compost bin that's shaped like this. And I know, it's important to think about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, but I'm going to be honest, I don't put enough thought into it sometimes. And so like this part of the workshop, I think has a lot of some of the best advice here as far as moisture. And so you're going to see later the things that I've not done well with my compost bins too. So I just kind of wanted to bring that to your attention now that it's really important that you get this information here, because that's what's helped me, and what's going to help me be a better composter in the long run.
Also, you want to keep covered. Use a compost lid or cardboard or canvas over the top of your pile as much as possible. And in a little while, Savannah will be discussing different composting methods and what has worked best for her. And here's a slide discussing the moisture content of compost materials, just so you have an idea of what that moisture content is. The most moisture comes from the vegetable and fruit scraps, which is 80 to 90% moisture content. Then we have our grass clippings at 80%, leaves at 40%, sawdust at 40%, and shrub trimmings about 15%. And again, we'll go over again the recipe for success. Again, the 3-to-1 carbon-nitrogen ratio is extremely important. You want to aerate at least once per week using a pitchfork or a shovel, whatever you have handy, to make sure that it is aerated at least once per week. Also, a thick base layer of brown materials, as I mentioned before, is including sticks or wood chips, maybe straw, or shredded paper or cardboard, promotes air circulation. So you want to keep a base layer of brown materials, and that's very important for the start of your compost pile. And then you want to ensure proper moisture content. Again, it should feel like a wrung out sponge. You can add water if necessary. Pile needs to be damp but not too wet, so you can tarp the pile as needed. So a recipe for success is carbon plus nitrogen plus oxygen plus water plus time equals success. And we're going to go over a few things to troubleshoot some problems that folks typically come across with backyard compost bins. And I'm going to go over the top 3 common causes of odors. The first one is lack of air, or an anaerobic pile. If the compost pile doesn't get enough air, anaerobic microorganisms take over. Aerobic bacteria decompose materials quickly with little odor. Anaerobic bacteria decomposes materials slowly and create a strong odor. And you can fix this by aerating the pile and adding shredded newspaper or dry leaves if the pile is too wet. So if you've had a lot of rain and the pile is just too wet, you just add more shredded paper or dry leaves to fix that problem. Also, decomposing food scraps cause odors. You want to make sure you bury the food scraps deep into the compost pile to minimize those odors. Add a layer of leaves to mask odors and keep the critters away. And then bury very smelly veggie scraps such as broccoli very deep in the compost pile. You want that covered with leaves. You can always add activated carbon to the pile if odors persist. Also, another problem with odors in compost piles include too much nitrogen. So compost will begin to smell like ammonia if you have too much nitrogen, which is the green materials, and not enough carbon-rich brown materials. So again, you want to add dry leaves or maybe some sawdust to your pile if this happens. So here's some good chart of talking about some of the smells and problems that you may have with your compost pile. If you smell kind of a garbage smell, the cause is that food scraps are exposed or too close to the surface. Again, you want to bury your food scraps with leaves every time you add food to the pile, so that each and every time you add that layer of leaves to the pile. If you smell an ammonia smell, That means the pile has too much nitrogen or green materials. You want to add more carbon or brown sources such as leaves, shredded newspaper, or cardboard. If you smell a rotten egg smell, that means the pile has too much moisture. You want to leave the lid off your bin if you're using a bin, and incorporate dry material until it is just merely damp, again like a wrung out sponge. If your pile is not decomposing at all, the pile may be too dry, it may be too small, or it may need more nitrogen. So make sure that pile is damp. Add more material until your pile is at least 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. And add high nitrogen materials such as food scraps. If you have lots of sticks or matted leaves, that means the material is too large to decompose. So you always want to shred those leaves or cut materials like branches before you add to the pile. If you're having problems with pests, such as ants and bees and so forth, that means the pile is not hot enough to discourage them. And you want to aerate the pile and add high nitrogen materials such as food scrap or grass clippings. And if you have plants growing in your pile, you either have finished compost or the pile is not hot enough. So you can go ahead and harvest the compost, or if you think it's not hot enough, you can aerate the pile to encourage heat retention. And here's another infographic. Again, it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but at the end of the presentation, we'll provide you with the slides so that you can take a better look at this. But it just tells you how to fix a smelly compost pile and how to fix it. So just kind of going over what we just discussed, but it's kind of a nice infographic to have. Now I'm going to go over, there's 5 main composting methods I'm going to discuss today that you can do in your backyard depending on how much space you have or what kind of method you think would work best for your household. The 5 composting methods include holding units, turning units, heap composting, what's called sheet composting, and trench composting. And all this information was found through the Illinois web extension, and the URL is found below on the screen. First, I'll discuss holding units. Holding units are bins used to hold yard and food scrap until composting is complete. They need little maintenance, and some models can be used by apartment dwellers for composting on balconies. So if you have a small space, if you live in an apartment, a condo, or have a small yard, this might be a good method for you. Generally, it's easy to use, but the compost process is much slower because it's difficult to turn the heap, and also the lack of aeration makes the compost process take a much longer time period. So there's pros and cons to it. Turning units, bins are designed to be turned or aerated. They work faster than holding units because anaerobic bacteria are provided with oxygen needed to break down materials. And when organic materials are turned or mixed on a regular basis, maybe every 5 to 10 days, compost can be created in 2 months or less. And so turning units also do not require a lot of space. And if they are maybe a little bit more pricey than our holding unit here, but they may provide with compost in a quicker time frame. And frequent turning offers important advantages for the turning units. Compost is created faster, and then higher temperatures are produced as a result of turning. So, and it will kill major disease organisms as well. And then there's also heap composting. This can be fairly easily implemented if you have a good backyard space. And Heap is similar to composting with holding and turning units, except it does not require a structure. So if you have a bigger backyard, this might be a better option for you. And the recommended dimensions for a heap, according to University of Illinois Web Extension, is 5 feet wide by 3 feet high. And of course, the length can vary depending on the amount of materials used. Heaps take more space due to gravity, so the wider width will help the pile retain heat better. And you want to aim for a pile that is at least 1 cubic yard. So that would be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet for 1 cubic yard. And materials can be added as they are generated, or they can be stored until enough are available to make a good size heap. And turning the heap is optional in this type of composting method. And then there's what's called sheet composting, and that involves spreading a thin layer of organic materials such as leaves over a garden area, also known as lasagna composting. So you would spread a 2 to 4 inch layer of organic material on the soil surface and till it in. And so leaves, garden debris, grass clippings, veggie, and fruit scraps are examples of materials that can be tilled into the soil. And then to aid in decomposition, materials should be shredded or chopped prior to layering. And again, this type of method, this sheet composting, is best if you have a larger space of land. The downsides to sheet composting is that carbon-containing residues will call upon the nitrogen reserves of the soil for their decomposition, and high nitrogen materials may release their nitrogen too quickly in the wrong form. So it's better to do sheet composting in the fall because it may take a full season in the soil. There's also trench composting. And this is probably the simplest way to compost fruit and veggie scraps. And the way to do this is to dig a 1 foot deep hole in your yard. Again, this requires more space in the yard. You would chop and mix food scraps and leaves into the soil about 4 to 6 inches, and then cover with at least 8 additional inches of soil. You also want to place a marker on top of the location. Decomposition will usually occur in 6 months to a year, depending on the soil temperature, the supply of microorganisms in the soil, and the content of the materials. You want to wait 6 months to 1 year before planting on top. And here's kind of a diagram. I won't go into detail about trench composting. Again, you'll have these slides at the end of the presentation, but it kind of shows you why you want to mark your areas for the trench composting so that you can go into each section as needed. So as we discussed a little bit, there's different types of compost bins in the past. So we talked about contained bins, and then there's tumblers, and then wire leaf bins. And the contained single unit bin, you can either do it yourself and create your own compost bin using a garbage receptacle, or you can purchase a specified compost bin in store. And here's a do-it-yourself option. I'm not going to go over it in a lot of detail, but all you will need is a 32-gallon plastic or galvanized trash can with a lid. You'll need a drill bit that's at least 1/4 inch, shovel, a couple bungee cords, gloves, and safety glasses to create your do-it-yourself option. And here's the instructions. So I won't go through this in detail again, but you would drill holes into the can. You turn it upside down, and then you would flip the can upright and drill holes in each side of the can, and also on on the lid of the can as well. So to fill up this do-it-yourself option, you would fill the compost bin about a third full with grass clippings and leaves. You would spray it with water so it is damp, and then you add the layers of acceptable materials as we discussed. And then you would secure the lid with 2 bungee cords crosswise, and then you would roll the bin every few days. So you just put it on its side, start rolling it, and you want to store it in a sunny location to expedite the composting process. And then there's also the do-it-yourself pallet bin option. We did this webinar a couple years ago, and we had a little demonstration about the do-it-yourself pallet bin option. So if you're interested in this, we could provide you a resource with that video. What you will need is 3 pallets. You can ask around for different businesses. I think there's some feed stores like Prairie Land Feeds in Savoy and places like that that have pallets that give those away to folks that ask for them. And you would need 12-inch heavy-duty zip ties, so maybe 18 to 20 of those. And in this case, you of course want to find a level, sunny area in your yard to place or to create this pallet bin option. You want to start by attaching 2 pallets together with the zip ties to form a 90-degree angle, and continue doing this for the other sides. And then layer materials, making sure to add water to each layer. And you want to add shredded cardboard or paper to the bottom of the bin, maybe in some sticks, and then you add your garden and food scraps on top with soil. And then the tumbler, what we just discussed a little while ago, it does have some advantages. It has a quick compost time. It's finished compost in about 4 to 6 weeks. It has a neat appearances. It's great for a limited backyard space. It's easier to aerate, and then it sits off the ground, so that may deter critters. The disadvantages, it's a small unit, so it fills quickly, and once the unit is filled, you have to wait until the compost process is complete, so you're kind of limited in how much you can put in it. The wire leaf bin, advantages are it's easy to create, it's affordable, it provides aeration, and it keeps the pile neat. And disadvantages, you need to water more often. It's not critter proof, and seeds may sprout outside the wire mesh. And all of these types of bins are in more detail through some worksheets and resources that we'll provide you at the end of this webinar. So whichever type of compost method or bin that you want to use, once you have the finished product, the finished compost, it's time to harvest the compost and use it. So you may use the compost as is, or use a mesh screen to filter out large pieces or impurities. There's many online sources on how to create a screen, so you can refer to those to filter out those large pieces or impurities so you have the best compost possible. And to use your compost, you want to place it in any kind of garden beds that you have. Again, it amends the soil. It also shades soil and maintains moisture levels. It also amends soil in poor soil conditions. So as I mentioned before, we have clay soil in our East Central Illinois area, and that really does provide a good amendment to the soil. You can use in both indoor or outdoor potted plants, and use as a lawn top dressing. And you can also use on your raised garden beds. And they recommend for garden beds you use 60% topsoil, 30% compost, and then 10% potting mix. And here's a calendar that, again, you'll have at the end of the webinar, so you can go back to it. It's pretty handy. It's a maintenance calendar of what you should do in each season. And so spring, summer, fall, winter, and it tells you what you should do to maintain that compost bin for every season. For example, here in the spring months, You want to gather remaining brown leaves in your yard to add to the pile. You want to aerate compost weekly. You want to harvest in late spring to use compost for new beds. You want to watch for moisture from spring rains. So with a lot of rain, you got to again watch that moisture, make sure the compost pile isn't too wet. You can add old potting soil and last year's plants to the pile, and you can start a hot composting pile if you need to finish the compost quickly. And so each month or each season, you have a little calendar just to keep you on schedule of what you should do with your compost pile. And finally, I'm going to talk about local ordinances. And that's important because before starting a backyard compost bin or pile, you want to check with your local jurisdictions on whether or not they have composting ordinances or regulations. And so if you're in a city or if you're in the county, you want to check with them before starting that compost pile. You also, if you're part of a homeowners association, you want to contact them to make sure that you're doing things correctly in case they have specific requirements in your HOA. I'll talk about the City of Urbana and City of Champaign in this presentation. So the City of Urbana, we do not have any specific ordinance pertaining to backyard composting. However, it's always good to follow the practices we discussed so that you can reduce odors, pests, and so forth, and also be a good neighbor and follow those practices. The City of Champaign, however, does have an ordinance regarding backyard composting. And I've laid it out here so you have a reference if you're a City of Champaign resident. And it talks about some of the main things: the size of the compost pile. It should not exceed 125 cubic feet in volume and 5 feet in height. And it also, the compost pile must be restrained on all three sides to minimize blowing material. And the side walls should allow for aeration. And then again, compost pile should not be located in a floodway or be set back less than 3 feet from any property line or be closer than 15 feet to a neighbor's dwelling. You also don't want to locate your compost pile in the front yard or have any leachate running from the compost pile. So these are important things to go over if you're a City of Champaign resident, to go through this ordinance. And I've kind of laid this out again in the webinar, so you can look over their ordinance in detail. And so we have that as a reference. They also talk about what materials are accepted, what are unaccepted. So acceptable materials include things like dirt, grass clippings, veggie and fruit scraps, woody materials, leaves, small amounts of wood ash or fertilizer. And then unacceptable materials, construction and demolition debris, treated wood products, pesticides, fish or animal carcasses, and so forth, meat, metal items, and so forth. And finally, I have a listing of some recommended reads that I took for this presentation. I thought they were very useful and helpful, and we will also provide you with these slides at the end of this webinar and some worksheets and resources. And now I will open it up to any questions that anyone has, and I thank you for your time. Great. Thank you, Savannah.
Thanks, Courtney.
And we will open it up to any questions. It looks like there is someone who's interested in hearing about hot composting, which Savannah, you said after your video that you could maybe discuss a bit.
Well, I can speak a little bit more to that now. I mean, what I'm going to show you is 3 different composting setups that I have at home. And one of them is a rolling compost bin. So I kind of talk about how I can use that more readily as my hot composter because I'm able to turn it more often and it's movable. I can put it somewhere that's sunnier in my yard to help build up the temperature. My other two compost, one is like a heap that's in a couple of stalls. And the other is like a single contained unit, I think is what Courtney referred to it as. And those are kind of in a shadier area of my house. And I am very honest, I'm kind of lazy about turning those over. So I don't do it as much. So there's benefits of each of the different styles, but you'll hear me mention that I do throw a lot of weeds and weed seeds in my compost pile because that's what I get a lot of I have a big yard. And it's best not to take that like cold composted compost with weed seeds in it and put that on my garden beds. I'm going to get a lot of more weeds coming back that way. But if I finish it off with a hot composting process, it'll kill a lot of those weed seeds. So I kind of mentioned that, I can take the product of these heap compost piles and I can put it in my tumbler and probably honestly add more carbon to it, because when you're hot composting, maybe you remember early in Courtney's presentation, she said, ideally you want to shoot for 30-1, but we're going to do 3-1, right? That seems like a big difference, right? It's a 10-fold difference. 3-1 is a lot more achievable, but like 25 or 30-1, that's going to activate your hot composting a lot more. So the more carbon that you have, it's gonna make that process go faster. I mean, as Courtney also mentioned, there's aerobic decomposition and there's anaerobic decomposition. And then there's even just physical decomposition by creatures that are in your soil. Another tip that I'll point out that I sort of mentioned is that you can use existing soil or existing finished compost that you have and add that into your tumbler or into your other compost heaps and layer that in, and that will accelerate the process as well. So pretty much, what I know about hot composting is that you need that higher carbon ratio, that it needs to be turned a lot more, and that you're looking for that temperature to get like over 100 degrees. It gets pretty hot. I'm kind of like a layperson gardener though. So I'm not gonna tell you all that technical side. There are a lot of resources out there about hot composting, but I'm gonna take a minute and let you all ask any other questions that you might have. And I'm gonna queue up the video of me taking you on a tour of my yard just right out here. So I'm gonna queue that up. Feel free to ask questions in the meantime.
There are a couple of questions that came in the chat that I was curious about the answers to as well.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay. Yeah. Savannah, do you have those chat questions right by you? Okay.
Sorry,
Yes,
I'm working from 2 devices.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
This wasn't our plan today, but tech always has some hurdles. All right, so I see you have a dual tumbler. As each side begins to compost down, can I add them together? Yes, you can add them together. I would just keep on monitoring the moisture content and trying to achieve a good balance. Courtney's got a lot of those troubleshooting resources. If it's this, then do this, right? Courtney, I can't remember the name of that resource, that troubleshooting page that you had, but I really liked that one.
Yes, there's a troubleshooting page, and it should, at the end of the webinar here, we'll send you the slides. It didn't show up as well on this presentation, but yeah, I would say check those moisture levels, of course, aerate as necessary, and that should work okay. And I think there was another question you had regarding kitchen food scraps from the kitchen, incorporating that into your outdoor compost bin. That is totally fine. I would just say, just to reduce odors and pests from coming through into the compost, you want to just make sure they're buried deep into the compost. And again, you follow the best practices of aerating at least once a week, depending on the season and so forth, and making sure that the compost pile is moist. And one thing I didn't mention that some people may have questions about is there's also a certain degree of temperature that people have asked me about. What's the proper temperature for a compost pile. If you really want to get fancy, they have compost thermometers, but typically you don't want the temperature to go over 160 degrees Fahrenheit because that will be too hot. So they usually say the recommended amount is about 135 to up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit for a proper compost pile, if that's something that you're interested in doing as well.
So I saw the question, I have a tumbler. Do you recommend turning it every day or once a week like the piles? If you're trying to hot compost, if you turn it every day, that's going to be a faster process. The more often you turn it, from my understanding, the faster that process is going to go. If it starts to cool down, you want to turn it again. And then we are going to talk a little bit about small indoor units, and there'll be time for questions after that as well. So I think Stuart might be our pro here on that topic, but I've got a lot of experience with vermiculture, which is the indoor composting with worms. All right, I see one more question in the chat. Okay, I think all the questions have been answered. A lot of great questions today. Thanks, everyone. All right, so I am going to play this demo. It's only 10 minutes long. Feel free to, we can stop and pause it and ask questions anytime.
Hi, everybody. My name is Savannah Donovan, and I work at the Anita Purvis Nature Center. And I'm here to show you my compost setup that I have at home. So there are lots of different ways that you can compost. There's many different types of bins available, or different ways that you might choose to set up your composting situation at home. So what I'm going to do is just show you what I've got and kind of talk about some of the pros and cons of each, so that you can make a better informed decision to purchase something or set up what's going to work for you at your house. So first, I want to show you these stalls. Now, a couple years ago, we did a composting workshop where we demoed how to build these stalls from old pallets. And it's really simple. We basically just zip tied these pallets together. They're reclaimed pallets, which is a nice reuse for them. Also, they're not treated wood, which is good also. So I've got two stalls here, and one of them is quite full, and honestly it's getting a little bit unmanageable almost. You don't really want to fill up a stall too big because you want to be able to get in there and turn your compost over. So this stall is looking better. This is some blend of different kinds of garden waste and food scraps from home. This was actually covered up by a lot of sticks and leaves, and I just kind of took that top layer off to show you the quality of this compost here. Now you're probably going to read or learn that it's always good to turn your compost over. And so, every once in a while you can get in here and mix your compost up to see if it's really, homogeneous, if things have broken down a lot. Or if it still needs some time to age. I know there's still some sticks and a few larger pieces in here, but honestly, this is good enough for me to start applying to my garden beds. I don't mind, hand picking out some of those sticks and things. This is pretty much ready to roll. So this is my good compost over here. Now, if I wanted to let that keep aging, I would add some of this pile over. One of the benefits of having multiple stalls is that you can, instead of turning it over within the stall, you can turn it from one stall to the next. So now theoretically, if I got all of this debris here that's not very well broken down and I moved it into another stall, I probably got a good amount of compost underneath here as well that's ready to use. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get a wheelbarrow, fill it up with all of this compost for my garden bed, and then I'm gonna take the top half of this pile, put it back over here in this stall, and I'm kind of ready to start from scratch. So this is for processing a lot of compost. I don't like to send my garden waste off, I don't send it to the landscape recycling center, even though that's a great alternative. If you do have sticks or limbs or other yard waste that you need to get rid of, it's a great way to recycle it. But if you want to try to do everything at home, I really fill this up with trimmings when I trim my hedges, leaves when I rake my leaves in the fall, all kinds of sticks and pieces of plants from, last year, kind of when your plants wilt and die back. You take all that stuff and I just throw it on the top of the pile here. So this is a pretty low maintenance situation that I've got. I could have another stall if I wanted to. I could also put a front door on these stalls. It's nice if you have it so it can hinge open so that you can get in there and access it, but it helps to keep it contained and keep it from flowing out into your yard if that's not something that you're comfortable with. All right, I'm going to show you another compost bin that I have. I like to keep my shovel and pitchfork out while I'm working with my compost. These are the two tools that I use most often for these two setups here. So this is the free garden earth bin. I was really liking to put a lot of my food scraps in here because it has a lid, so it keeps the animals out of it. So you can see they've tried. There's some chew marks. This thing's a few years old, so the squirrels have gnawed on it a little bit. I'm going to open it up, give you a glimpse inside. It's got just one way for me to remove the lid here. And inside you'll see there's a layer of leaves here, and then I've started to put some of my fresh organic matter on top. So you'll see some watermelon rinds and eggshells here, some weeds on top here. The best way to do these is to really make a concerted effort to layer your greens and your browns. Greens are, typically green plants or food waste, and your browns are your dead things, so your dried leaves and twigs. And layering it is going to both, make sure that it doesn't get smelly, it keeps the bugs down, it keeps the critters out. So there are, best practices. Please look to our resources that we have available. But there's kind of a happy medium that you want to strike in there with, the percentage of browns versus greens. So some nice things about this setup is, like this over here, it's open soil on the bottom of it. So there's no bottom to this container, and that allows soil organisms and microorganisms to go up from the ground and into your compost. And they are really what's going to be processing most of that and turning it into soil again. So that's a great plus on this. Another thing I like about this bin is it's got this easy access point in the front. So if I'm doing well composting this in this bin, I should have fresh, ready to use compost that's able to come out of the bottom here. I will tell you, it's kind of dry in there. I don't have fresh compost that's ready to use right now. So there's a combination of things going on here. It's not getting enough moisture in here is one. So I could take a hose out and I could add some moisture to this. That would help to speed things along. Worms, soil need a wet soil, damp soil to be able to dry. At your location would also heat up and allow some decomposition just by the temperature. So things can get hot in a black composting bin, and again, it just speeds that process along. But I don't expect, if it was really hot in here, that I'd get as many soil organisms. They might be found, lower in the levels here, but probably not higher up. So now I'm going to show you a third setup that I have. This is a rolling compost bin. This takes the mechanical turning over with like a shovel, and it lets you just spin it. So that's a great plus for this setup. I don't have to get my shovel like I do with the other two setups here and turn things over and make sure that they're getting processed. I just have to turn it. So you can do half a turn every day. Now you'll notice there is not going to be any fresh soil in here unless I add scoops of soil to it. So you can add soil to any of your compost setups, and that's going to have some soil microorganisms in it. So in fact, if I were to take fresh soil and layer it in any of my compost bins, it should help to speed up that process. I don't know how long a worm would live in here if it was trying to decompose all of my compost. It does have some holes in here for drainage, but they're small enough to keep the critters out. These can get really warm. So if I were to place this in a sunny spot in my yard, it could get, again, really hot in here and really break things down. So one thing I've considered is, if I want to be able to apply compost to my garden bed that is like relatively sterile, it doesn't, if I'm not wanting to have any weed seeds or other things sprouting, then it's good to hot compost that, and it kind of kills off any of those seeds or other things before you put it on your garden bed. So this could also serve as like a last stage. This is how you access this one. So it's not quite as convenient for daily use because you do have to screw and unscrew, which I'm not doing a good job demonstrating right now. There we go. This one's empty right now. I haven't started using this new bin, but it just comes off like this. So pretty simple. All right, now I do have one more very small scale composting operation at my house. It's really more of a vermiculture than a vermicomposting situation right now. So we are growing some composting worms inside our house. So I don't keep this outside. I keep this inside my home. They actually live on our kitchen counter. And these little worms, they're kind of our pets now. So there are red wigglers in here, and we're just feeding them and encouraging them to grow and lay eggs. And as they do, we can upgrade to a larger vermicompost system. If you're attending one of our workshops or you're looking at some of our resources, there should be a lot more resources available for how to construct a larger scale vermicompost or vermiculture bin at your home. So again, thank you so much for joining me on this tour of compost, and I hope to see you again sometime. Thank you. Bye.
All right, so that was, like I said, I'm not any kind of professional composting person. I'm just a real world person trying to manage my waste at home. So I don't do everything perfectly, but I also have learned a lot from my mistakes. And, I often have to go back and refer to, like that troubleshooting page I was mentioning earlier that Courtney has. If this is your problem, here's what your solution is. And like I was also noting, sometimes it's just adding some water to your compost bin, making sure that you have more moisture, or that you are hitting that, nice balance of greens versus browns. I mean, at this point, if anybody wants to unmute yourselves and ask questions, you're welcome to do that too. I see one just came in on the chat. Huh. This is about, in the chat, the comment is about mulching leaves. That's such a great question. What impact will the high tannin level have on your compost? I believe it makes it more acidic. Courtney, do you have a better answer to that question?
I think that's the case too, but I will have to look into that further. And I think we have your information from the webinar, so I will have to get back to everyone actually, because that's a great question, and look into that because that's a great, I don't know the answer right offhand, but I do think that would cause more acidity, but I want to make sure that's correct.
I see what you quoted has Doug Tallamy's name on it, and I would trust anything that Doug Tallamy says. He is a good resource. He's very eco-conscious about gardening and how to mulch and things like that. So I would trust Douglas Tallamy. But yeah, that's a great question. Often in the fall, I have a big maple tree in my front yard. I'll pile a lot of leaves around the base of that tree and just encourage them to stay in place as much as possible. What from my understanding is that if you remove your leaves from your trees every year, if you just send them off, you're taking nutrients away from those trees that aren't going to be replenished in the soil. But if you compost and you place compost on top of those tree roots, that's going to replenish some of those nutrients that it loses when it loses all of its leaves. But yes, we do need to get a little bit more information on that. So our next topic is going to be vermiculture, and then we can have some more discussion on vermiculture and vermicomposting. If you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but I'm gonna let Stuart from Vermiculture take it away.
Thank you so much, Savannah. I have some members with me today. Tiffany, could you share your screen?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'll start. So hey everyone, we're from Vermiculture, and today we want to share some information about vermicomposting, the importance of doing it, and also some information about our organization, including some programs available to you to participate in the future. So let's get started. Next. So this is our agenda for today. We will first start by sharing the background on how our organization was started. Then we will move on and talk about vermicomposting and also the impacts that we have made to our community. And last but not least, our future plan. Next. The first portion of today's presentation is going to be about the start of our organization, specifically on the problems that we wanted to tackle. In other words, the reason we created our organization. We first identified that food waste is a major global problem that is responsible for producing 3.3 billion tons of CO2 gas annually. And most of the gas are produced in the landfill, and CO2 is not the only gas emitted through the decomposition of food in the landfill. There are plenty other gases that badly impact our environment as well. We also found that in Urbana-Champaign area, the option of sustainable food waste disposal available for the community is very limited. The final major problem that we identified is the massive amount of food wasted. Based on a research by a UI faculty, UI dining every day wasted 1 ton of food. Even though UI dining has a sustainable food waste disposal, we thought that wouldn't it be better if the amount of food waste is reduced? And so we think that it is important to educate people about this issue as well. Next. So a little bit about us. We first started as a group of people from YMCA UIUC. We went to the World YMCA Climate Action Summit last year. Our main focus is to address climate change issue related to food waste management. And to do so, we are providing composting kits for free and education materials to students, faculty, staff, and community members. Basically, anyone in the area who's interested in doing vermicomposting at home.
So what is vermicomposting? Vermicomposting is composting with earthworms. We use red wigglers and Indiana blues. Those are 2 of the 7 most commonly used earthworms for vermicomposting. It is an easy year-round composting method, and how it works is the worms aerate and fertilize the soil, creating a source of micronutrients for plants, and then you can later harvest those castings. And now what goes into a kit? So one of our big kits starts off with a 2 to 5 gallon container that is ideally food grade and opaque. We actually have had certain businesses donate containers to us to make it more sustainable. So Sam's Club, Michael's Catering, and UIUC Dining have actually donated. Then you want to get some bedding, which is either non-bleached paper, dry leaves, or straw, and mix that in with soil, which will increase the nutrients during the vermicomposting process. And then finally, you want to add your earthworms and add your greens, your leafy greens or other food. And then we'll take a look at a picture of our big bins. So here's one of our big bins. You can see all the newspapers, one of our red wigglers, and some of the leafy greens. You can also see that the texture is like a dampened sponge. The worms need oxygen to breathe, but they also like it to be a little bit wet, so it can't be too dry for them. And so maintaining your bin, you want to keep your worms happy. You want to keep your mini kit mostly in a dark container, in a dark place with a few holes in the lid so that they can breathe. You want to remember to mist the container, but if it does get too wet, you need to add some extra bedding so that they still have oxygen to breathe, and make sure that bedding is non-toxic. They really don't like bleached paper. You also want to remember to feed them appropriately to keep the composting from smelling and to keep them happy. They don't like rotting food, and they really like breads, leafy greens, vegetable scraps, some fruit peelings, but you really want to avoid citrus, onions, dairy, and meat. And then when you're ready to harvest, that's about 3 to 6 months in, depending on the amount of worms and the size of the kit. So you would want to dump the kit onto a really clean surface and allow the worms to burrow, and then gently scrub off the castings from the top and the sides. And then you can enjoy your castings by fertilizing your plants.
All right, so why choose vermicomposting instead of other composting methods? There's quite a few reasons. One of them is that vermicomposting can be done indoors, like in your own house, and it's really compact. So if you don't have like a yard in your home, that's perfectly fine. It's really easy to just do vermicomposting inside the house, and you're also able to keep composting during winter months when it's too cold for worms to be outside. And it's also a really affordable option. Regular like rotating composters and like indoor composting kits can cost upwards of $200, but our kits cost about $50. And it's reusable, obviously, so it'll just be like a one-time payment. And it's also very manageable as like regular composting methods. They require like a third party to bring food waste from like organizations or companies and like retrieve food waste. But for vermicomposting, you're able to do the composting yourself, like put in the food waste yourself, and like kind of like take care of your own bin yourself. So it doesn't require a third party, and it's really like easy to manage in that way. Okay. So far, Vermiculture has been able to reduce food waste in 48 households by making access to vermicomposting available to everyone. We sent out interest forms earlier in the semester, and so the 48 households are households that were able to get mini kits, like Savannah. And we were also able to reduce the general waste in 5 dining places and supermarkets. So these are like places that we were able to donate materials to us. And we also officially established as a registered student organization this semester and recruited 15 new members. And we're trying to recruit more continually. So we've also been able to partner with 7 organizations, like Michelle mentioned earlier, such as Sam's Club, UI Dining, UI Facilities and Services, and Michael's Catering in various initiatives. And generally, we've been able to educate a lot more people and spread awareness on what exactly vermicomposting is, and the whole process of it. So we've done this like through our social media pages on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, as well as our website that we recently created. And later on in the presentation, there will be links to the social media pages, so you'll be able to follow them if you'd like to keep it updated. So this is the mini kit distribution event that we hosted on April 17th and 18th. So it was socially distanced and COVID safe. So participants who signed up earlier came in and put their own bedding and soil in and mixed it around themselves. And we were able to put 5 to 10 worms in there into the mini kits, like the container and like the container that Savannah showed earlier. So these mini kits are primarily used for educational purposes for now, just as a way for people to get more familiar and comfortable with what exactly vermicomposting is. But later on, we'll be able to have like larger bins that people can get and actually use for food waste.
And so for the timeline for our organization, we are going to keep contacts with the companies and facilities that provides materials for us. And also we are going to increase awareness of vermiculture's goals and the presence in UIUC campus. And also in fall 2021, we are going to distribute full-size kits to the participants, and then we're going to have a follow-up with the participants to get some feedbacks and maybe increase the efficiency of our kit. Next. And also for our future plans, we are going to have a small-scale centralized vermicomposting system, which is already done in YMCA UIUC, and there are other possible locations, which is Randolph Street Community Garden and then St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. And then for our social media outreach, we are going to collaborate with other educational accounts through Instagram and then spread our organization page on Instagram and Facebook to recruit participants and acquire interest in the vermicomposting kits.
I would want to add a bit info on the small scale for my composting system. Actually, we don't have one yet, but we already got a green light from YMCA UIUC to have a vermicomposting system there, but we haven't had built that yet. The plan is to make the vermicomposting system the centralized one. We're planning to build that in fall or maybe in spring next year. And yeah, next. So if you would like to learn more about us and vermicomposting, feel free to check out our social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And we also have a website. We will be posting some education contents and updates about our organization there. Next. And here are our partners and sponsors. We have been partnering with UI Dining, Facilities and Services, Michael's Catering, and Sam's Club in reducing their food waste. In reducing their general waste. And we also have been getting some grants from YMCA and University of Illinois Student Sustainability Committee. Thanks.
All right, thank you to all our friends from Vermiculture. I just want to open up the floor to anybody who has questions about vermicomposting or vermiculture. And I'm also going to finally drop a couple links into the chat. The first is to a folder of resources where you can find slides and other things from today's presentations. And then there's also a link to a SurveyMonkey survey if you want to give us your feedback about the workshop today. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat or unmute yourself. So David asks, are there other methods of harvesting the castings? I've heard that you can start putting food scraps to one half to encourage the worms to move over and then harvest the other half. Is that viable? Yes, it depends on how many of those little worms you want to save and how many of their eggs you want to make sure stay in the bin. If you want to be really particular about it, the dump method is probably the best method because the worms will migrate to the bottom of the pile, and then you can just keep harvesting what's on the top. They'll migrate to the bottom, harvest what's on the top, and then put the remainder back in the bin. But yeah, it also works to just stop feeding them on one side of the bin, and eventually there shouldn't be very many over there. They have little like cocoons, like little tiny eggs that you can see inside your vermiculture bins, and kind of, you want to save those in your bin if you can. I'm going to share my screen really quickly just to show you this resources folder that we have. So when you open up that Google Drive link, Courtney's got some compost recipes in here. Courtney, I don't know if you want to speak about these a little bit more.
Yes, so I one of the books I recommended on my slideshow it's called Composting for a New Generation, and that's listed on the slideshow. And she had some great, what I call composting recipes to make it really easy for someone to start, a beginner to start a backyard composting bin or pile, I should say. And she gives specific ingredients, so to speak, on how to start that pile. So I thought this was a really helpful. So it talks about if you want to do a wire, like this example, a simple wire leaf bin or a hot compost. And then there's a few other pages as well for whatever method you would like to use. And Savannah, we also had, I think, a worksheet on a little quiz on what your the method that would work best for you. And it's like kind of a composting style quiz. And so you can answer each question and kind of determine what method would work best for you in your household using this worksheet. So that will be in the resource section as well, along with our slides. And again, I will try to get back to everyone regarding the question about the tannin as well, and look that up and get that answer to everyone as well. And then of course we have our slides listed, and then this recording as well.
Mm-hmm. And I do have a few resources from previous vermicomposting presentations that I've given. This one was through the Environmental Education Association of Illinois and the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. But this is a step-by-step instructions for how to create kind of a larger scale bin. You can buy worms online. There was a great question in the chat about, would you buy worms, from online or find composting worms and add them to your pile outside? I don't recommend that because You don't know, those worms are probably not native to the area, and there have been some instances where the local soil ecology is being disturbed by non-native worms. And so you do want to be cautious. The worms that you find outside in a yard, they're not going to be good at composting inside. And the worms that are good at composting inside are not necessarily going to be good at composting outside. So there are different kinds of worms. But I just wanted to share with you, there are some more resources for, you can, build a larger bin like this one if that interests you. So check out those resources. If you have time, please complete that survey for us. Let us know what you think about our workshop today. Let me check the chat one more time, make sure we've answered everybody. Okay, so Julianne asks, how often do you feed your worms? That depends on how big of a bin you have, how many worms are inside of it. You can kind of gauge if they're not breaking down your material enough, they're probably getting too much food. Like, you want to just be able to keep pace with them. This isn't, you're not going to be able to process as much food waste as you would if you were composting outdoors, but it certainly does make a difference, and it makes some really high quality compost that you can put on your potted plants or in your garden. Thank you, Stuart, for also answering some questions in the chat. I appreciate that. There was a suggestion in one of the resources that you kind of take your vermiculture, vermicompost bin, and you imagine a grid across it, or you could even, make hash marks to create a sort of a grid across it. And then you'll vary where you put the food each day. So you would put your food in like section A on Monday and B on Tuesday. And so you move your food around the bin that way. So that by the time, your rotation's up, you're back at the first spot, and there should be that food that was there should have been broken down before you add more food to it. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming today. We'll stick around for a couple more minutes if anybody has any other questions. Let me know if you did not receive those links for the resources folder and the survey. If you have a moment to fill out that survey right now, we'd really appreciate your feedback. And have a great weekend, everyone. I hope you enjoy this beautiful day. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for joining us.
Just a minute. My kids have been super patient. Mostly. Okay, come here. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in. Thanks to Vermiculture for being here today. Stuart, thanks for organizing. What a great local resource that we have for people to be able to start their own bin.
Well, thank you for having us.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. We'll go ahead and close it.